So yes, so thank you again, and we're going to continue to our second speaker. For the next talk, we're happy to welcome Malika Auvray. Malika is a CNRS senior researcher in cognitive science at ISIR in Sorbonne University, and the head of the PYROS team, Perception, Interaction, and Social Robotics. Her research her research interests involve spatial cognition, multisensory perception, and sensory substitution. She has published 50 articles and book chapters and gave more than 120 communications on the topic. She is involved in the haptic research community, and in particular, she was co-chair at the program for the conference EuroHaptics 2014 and the co-editor of the resulting special issues in haptics. And today she'll be talking about the influence of sensory deficits, in particular visual and proprioceptive impairments and social cognition, such as social intelligence and anxiety, on spatial perspective taking. Professor Auvray, thank you very much for joining us today, and please take it away.
So first, thank you for inviting me. So I'm going to try to. Just always like this. So first, thank you for inviting me. And today I wanted to talk about spatial perspective taking. And the idea was to try and highlight why a better understanding of perspective taking is important to understand both self-perception and interactions with others. And to introduce the question, I wanted to show you a funny video from the 60s, and I think that's why it had a bug, and I'm not sure it will work, so I will just try. You'll tell me if it works.
Yes, but we cannot hear it. It's not sharing the sound.
Ah, okay.
Okay.
So I'm going to skip this part. Okay, there's always problem with Zoom, so it's not important. So basically, the idea was to say that information can be perceived from a variety of spatial perspectives, and this diversity is central to effectively interacting with our environment and other people. And first, objects can be subjectively experienced from the perspective of the self, and such an egocentric perspective can be anchored to the location of the body as a whole, or to body parts such as the head, the trunk, or an effector used to perform an action. Second, objects can be experienced from a decentered perspective, that is, a perspective external to the self, that can, for instance, be another person's location. And here, changing between an egocentric and a decentered perspective involves a transformation of spatial coordinates. Finally, allocentric representations concern object-to-object spatial relations independently from the individual, and they are typically used during navigation. And the perspective we adopt on stimuli can also evolve over time. We might, for instance, perceive a stimulus from an egocentric perspective, which is crucial for self-consciousness. And in particular, many studies point toward the central importance of the orientation of the head axis during spatial perspective tasks, both in unisensory and multisensory perception. And this has been taken to reflect the specific status of the head in the subjective location of the self. Then, when interacting with someone, we might switch to a perspective that is decentered from the self and the body. This perspective-taking process is crucial to understand how the world is perceived by others and to distinguish the self from others. From this, many questions can be asked. Which perspective is naturally adopted? What are people's ability to switch perspective? Is it an embodied process? We can also ask, do these abilities change as a function of sensory factors, such as visual and proprioceptive deficits? And do they change as a function of social or individual factors? And these are the different research questions I will describe right now. So to answer these questions, we used the graphesthesia task. And here, the participants wear on their stomach a tactile belt with an array of 9 vibrotactile stimulators that vibrate in sequence to spell out the letters B, D, P, or Q. and the participants report using a keyboard which stimulus they perceived. And the answer they give allow inferring the adopted perspective. So for instance, let's say that the letter B from my perspective in front of you is traced on your stomach by the vibrators. If you perceive a D, this means that you took a trunk-centered perspective like this. If you say it's a Q, you took a head-centered perspective as if you were bending forward to see the letter. And if you perceived a B, then you adopted a D-centered perspective. That is, you adopted my perspective. So in all the experiments we conducted, and we conducted plenty of them, the participants had a first session in which they were free to adopt the perspective that is the most natural to them. And we compiled all the results on 250 participants. And as we can see on the graph, half of the participants adopted a trunk-centered perspective, a third a head-centered perspective, and 20% a D-centered perspective. So we wanted to know now if this perspective is natural. And to do so, in the first experiment we conducted, the participants completed 3 sessions. So in the first one, they were free to adopt the perspective they wanted. And in sessions 2 and 3, a perspective was imposed to them, either the one they previously chose in session 1 or a different one. And this order was counterbalanced to disentangle between learning effects and switching cost. So from the results, we first see a decrease in reaction times with block, which shows a training effect. There was a cost, that is longer reaction times when changing from preferred perspective to the opposite one. And the participants were faster when coming back to their preferred perspective. So this suggests that the perspective people adopt is natural and not a simple arbitrary choice. We also computed the cost of changing perspective as a function of the natural perspective. And we saw that it varies as a function of the natural perspective. So people that are naturally decentered switch more easily to the egocentric perspective than the other way around. In that people that are naturally taking an egocentric perspective have a harder time taking the decentered perspective. So what is interesting here is that our protocol allows measuring not only the default perspective, but also the ability to switch from one perspective to another. And to summarize, in our task, we show important inter-individual variability, both in the perspective we adopt by default and in the flexibility in changing perspective. And I'm going to ask you to remember this paradigm as we will see it again, but I will re-explain it just after the next slide. So after asking, is it natural? The subsequent question was if there is an embodied nature of perspective taking. So here we did a slightly different paradigm. So we placed the matrix of tactile stimulators on 8 different body surfaces. And we asked the participants to adopt specifically the head-centered perspective to recognize the ambiguous letters, so the letters BDPQ, on these 8 body locations. So front and back of the trunk, right and left of the trunk, front and back of the thigh, and front and back of the shin. Okay, and what we think is that the head-centered perspective is particularly interesting for investigating embodied perspective taking, as it consists of mentally rotating the head toward the stimulated surface. Thus, it involves mentally changing body posture. And the results show that adopting a head-centered perspective on the body is easier for surfaces that can be easily looked at with real head movements. And it was harder to adopt for surfaces that are far away from the head, for example, the shin, or physically impossible to be directly looked at, such as the back, or even necessitating a greater quantity of movements. So overall, these results support the embodied nature of perspective taking. They show that mentally taking a spatial perspective on our body involves a mental change in body posture, which is influenced by physical body parameters. So we then wanted to investigate spatial perspective taking as a function of sensory factors, and first, the influence of vision. So we used here the graphesthesia protocol as I showed it to you in the first experiment. And here, this protocol was run by 3 groups of participants: early blind, late blind, and blindfolded sighted participants. So we had here 25 early blind, 32 late blind, and 28 blindfolded sighted controls. So as in the first experiment, the participants completed 3 sessions, one free session, in which they are free to adopt the perspective they prefer, one perspective imposed, which is the same as their preferred perspective, and one imposed with a different perspective. And in addition, we compared the results from this experiment with those previously obtained in the non-blindfolded sighted condition from the first experiment. So first, there was less decentered coordinates adopted by the early and late blind compared to the sighted blindfolded. This suggests that blindness reduces decentered spatial processing. Second, any condition without vision, meaning early blind, late blind, and sighted blindfolded, biases toward a head-centered perspective. Thus, even a temporary lack of vision promotes the adoption of egocentric spatial coordinates. And finally, the early blind had a greater cost of switching perspective compared to the sighted. This suggests that early visual experience is important for flexibly changing perspective. And there was no difference in switching cost between sighted and late blind participants. So we thus can see that there is an influence of vision, both on the perspective that is adopted naturally and on the ability to switch perspective. So we then turn to the influence of proprioception on spatial perspective taking. And this time we used a manual drawing on the head. And we did so, we didn't use the matrix, because we conducted the study with 2 differentiated patients that have neither tactile nor proprioceptive sensation below the head. And we know from the literature that former studies in control showed that the orientation of the perceiver, the perceived orientation, is between head orientation and body orientation. So here in the experiment we conducted, in the 2 differentiated patients and the control group, the ambiguous letters BDP and Q were manually drawn on the forehead, left and right surfaces of the head. And this was done when their head was oriented forward, leftward and rightward. So from the results, we can see in the controls that our results are in line with that of the literature. The adopted perspective varies with body posture, and the orientation of the self is a combination of trunk and head orientation. And on the other hand, in the differentiated patients, there was no effect of the stimulated body surface, nor of head orientation. So one of them always adopted an egocentric perspective, and the other one a decentered perspective. It looks as if the orientation of their self is not influenced by their physical body. And in addition, as we can see, the differentiated patients relied on different strategies, egocentric and decentered. So it might be the case that when internal information coming from the body is lacking, more cognitive strategies are adopted based on thinking about the body rather than feeling it. However, more data is needed to confirm this hypothesis. So those how a loss of input in one sensory modality affects task performance in another sensory modality can reveal a great deal about the functional architecture of sensory system. And in a review this year, we discussed the pattern of results from studies on sensory impairments beyond blindness and proprioception, and how that affects performance on tasks of perspective taking. So as we saw on former studies with similar tasks, shows that when people have an impairment in vision, they have better performance than controls when the perspective taken is egocentric, and worse with allocentric tasks. When they have an impairment of the vestibular system, they are worse for egocentric tasks and equals when the tasks involves decentering, perspective taking. In addition, they are better than controls for allocentric tasks and equals for decentering their body position. And proprioception, as we just did some studies, there's still a lack of data to conclude. Then we were interested in investigating if there is a link between spatial and social perspective taking. So here we run the graphesthesia task with the matrix of vibrators on the stomach in a group of participants who completed again the task during 3 sessions, as in the first experiment and the one with blind. So one session in which they are free to adopt any perspective they want, one with an imposed perspective, which is the same as their preferred one, and one with a different one. And the participants also completed additional scales. So one scale measured their social intelligence, and one measured their attachment style. And this latter scale model attachment along 2 dimensions, labeled attachment anxiety, which is characterized by a fear of interpersonal rejection and abandonment, and avoidance, which is characterized by an exaggerated sense of independence and emotional distancing from others. So regarding social intelligence, higher scores in social information processing were associated with more egocentric responses in the free session. This suggests that the ability to understand and predict information regarding social relations is related to a strong natural perspective. Also, we found a stronger benefit of returning to one's natural perspective when people also have higher social intelligence, self-reported through questionnaires, social intelligence. So regarding attachment style, a greater cost of switching to an unnatural perspective was associated with lower self-reported anxious attachment. And as the majority of participants in our study adopted a self-centered perspective in the free session, this can suggest that higher levels of attachment anxiety may bias the participants to more frequently adopt others' perspective, possibly reflecting their need to take into account how others perceive them. So in summary, a strong grounding in one's natural perspective is associated with lower interpersonal anxiety and higher social intelligence. So to summarize the results we found so far, the perspectives adopted by default are natural with important inter-individual variability. The graphesthesia task allows investigating flexibility in switching perspective, which was previously overlooked. There's an influence of vision. The lack of vision, be it permanent or temporary, biases toward an egocentric perspective. In addition, early blind have a greater cost of switching perspective. There is an influence of proprioception. So in the deafferented patient, unlike the controls, the adopted perspective is not influenced by stimulus location and body orientation. And there's an influence of social skills and attachment style on spatial perspective taking. So for future research, my aim is to investigate the hypothesis that social perspective taking abilities are grounded on spatial perspective taking abilities. And there are several findings that point toward this direction. First, perspective taking is described in the literatures of spatial and social cognition with similar terms used to describe taking another spatial and mental point of view. Second, recent studies show that performance in spatial perspective taking tasks is associated with social skills as well as emotional empathy. Social abilities also predict different approaches to spatial perspective taking tasks, such that individuals with higher social skills as well as empathy engage more in embodied strategies, that is mentally rotating themselves, rather than rule-based object rotation strategies. And it is worth mentioning that while spatial perspective taking abilities appear related to cognitive and affective perspective taking, it does not appear to be the case for other non-perspective taking spatial abilities, such as mentally rotating objects. And finally, impairments in spatial perspective taking and mentalizing about others' beliefs are found in individuals with ASD as well as schizophrenia, suggesting potential links between spatial and mental perspective taking abilities. So these results suggest that some social and emotional perspective taking abilities are grounded on spatial ones. And I'm at the moment exploring the extent to which it is the case by investigating jointly performance in spatial and social perspective taking tasks in neurotypical controls, as well as people with ASD and schizophrenia. So normally my talks finishes here, and I thank my collaborators. And I'm just gonna take 2 more minutes just to bounce back, because I've added these 2 slides while Charles were talking and during the discussion about why I came to be interested on this big question of perspective taking, and then the link between spatial and social perspective taking. And it came first from an interest in sensory substitution. So I was interested in sensory substitution and the process of distal attribution. So Charles already said it, and I wanted to use more complex devices, but to summarize it, in sensory substitution, you have basically a camera that is filming the external scene, and then a conversion device. And then in real time, the visual stimuli are converted into tactile stimuli on the skin. And I was interested in how people transition from a tactile perception to a visual perception. And here it means understanding how people transitions from sensing the tactile stimuli on their body to perceiving the object as being located in front of them, a perception at a distance. And I think I can use the graphesthesia task, because we can understand how we transition from proximal attribution, centered on the stimulated body part, to a distal attribution. And I started, and then I realized that it's entirely false to say that touch is always encoded according to a somatosensory reference frame. It can be centered on the stimulated body part, it can be head-centered, or it can be decentered. And all this with important intra and inter-individual variability. So I'm not going to help Charles to your question, because the question of distal attribution in the sensory system, and in particular in touch, appears to be far more complex than what we anticipated. Hence, all the line of research we developed next. So anyway, I'm going to stop here, and thank you for your attention.